My name is Charlotte Mitchell, and 3 days ago I stood in my cap and gown watching my own graduation party unfold without me. Instead of celebrating alongside my family and their distinguished guests, I was in the kitchen wearing a server's apron, carrying trays of champagne to people who saw me as invisible help. What they didn't know was that in less than 2 hours, everything they believed about success, worth, and family hierarchy would shatter completely. Before I tell you how that evening became the sweetest vindication of my life, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, and hit that subscribe button if you've ever been underestimated by the people who should have believed in you most. Trust me, you'll want to see how this story ends. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Connecticut, I learned early that in the Mitchell family, appearances mattered more than authenticity. My mother, Patricia Mitchell, was a former debutante who had married into old money and never let anyone forget it. My father, Richard Mitchell III, came from a long line of investment bankers and expected his children to uphold the family's sterling reputation. They had built their entire social identity around having the perfect family with perfect children, destined for perfect lives. My older sister Victoria embodied everything they valued. With her platinum blonde hair, effortless charm, and natural ability to navigate social situations, she was their crown jewel. Victoria attended cotillion, served on charity boards, and had been accepted to Yale before she'd even taken her SATs. She was studying art history with plans to marry well and continue the family tradition of beautiful, accomplished wives who graced magazine covers at charity galas. Then there was me, the family anomaly. While Victoria glided through life with grace and privilege, I questioned everything. At family dinners, I'd ask uncomfortable questions about our investments, about why we donated to certain charities but not others, about the ethics of some of my father's business practices. Charlotte asks too many questions became my mother's standard explanation when relatives wondered why I seemed different from my sister. The pattern of exclusion started early. I remember being 7 years old, standing in my best dress at my cousin's wedding reception, watching my parents introduce Victoria to important guests while I remained invisible beside them. "This is our daughter Victoria," my mother would say with pride. "She's going to be quite the little socialite." When adults would notice me and ask about the other daughter, the response was always dismissive. "Oh, that's just Charlotte. She's different." By high school, I had learned to find my own path. While Victoria was queen of the social scene, I threw myself into academics and community service, but not the kind that looked good on country club newsletters. I tutored underprivileged kids, volunteered at homeless shelters, and started a nonprofit to provide school supplies to low-income families. My guidance counselor, Mrs. Rodriguez, was the first adult to truly see my potential. "Charlotte," she told me during a college planning meeting, "you have something special. Your compassion combined with your analytical mind and work ethic. You could change the world." When I shared this conversation at dinner, my father barely looked up from his newspaper. "Mrs. Rodriguez is paid to encourage all students," he said dismissively. "Focus on realistic goals." The divide became a chasm during college applications. Victoria was already at Yale, majoring in art history, and dating the son of a Fortune 500 CEO. When I expressed interest in social work and public policy, my parents' reaction was swift and brutal. "Social work?" my mother repeated as if I'd announced plans to join a circus. "Charlotte, we've invested too much in your education for you to throw it away on a career that pays nothing and has no social standing." Despite their disapproval, I was accepted to Columbia University with a partial scholarship, planning to double major in social work and business administration. My vision was to eventually run a nonprofit organization that could create systemic change in poverty alleviation. The night I received my acceptance letter, our family dinner celebration lasted exactly 3 minutes before the conversation returned to Victoria's latest social triumph. "Columbia is prestigious," my father acknowledged grudgingly, "but this social work nonsense needs to stop. You'll major in business and come work for the family firm after graduation. It's time you started acting like a Mitchell." That ultimatum became the defining moment of my college years. I was 18 years old, determined to pursue my passion, but financially dependent on parents who viewed my dreams as personal embarrassments. The compromise I made haunts me still. I would major in business as they demanded, but I'd minor in social work and continue my nonprofit work on the side. College became a double life. Officially, I was Charlotte Mitchell, business major and future investment banker. Secretly, I was Charlotte, the volunteer coordinator, the fundraiser, the young woman who spent her summers working with homeless families instead of interning at prestigious firms. I became an expert at crafting careful phone calls home, sharing just enough about my business courses to satisfy my parents while hiding the work that truly mattered to me. The deception worked until my senior year, when everything I had carefully compartmentalized was about to collide in the most public way possible. What my family didn't know was that my hobby of nonprofit work had quietly evolved into something extraordinary, something that would soon make their carefully constructed hierarchy of worth crumble before an audience of their most esteemed peers. The invitation to my graduation party arrived on cream-colored cardstock with gold embossing, exactly the kind of elegant stationery my mother favored for important occasions. The Mitchell family cordially invites you to celebrate Charlotte's graduation from Columbia University, it read, followed by details about the garden party they were hosting at our family estate. I should have been excited. After 4 years of struggling to balance my parents' expectations with my own values, I was finally graduating with highest honors. My business professors had praised my innovative approaches to sustainable capitalism, and my work with local nonprofits had earned recognition from the university's community service department. This should have been my moment of triumph. Instead, as I read the guest list my mother had carefully curated, I realized this party wasn't about celebrating my achievements. It was about displaying the Mitchell family's success to their social circle, with me as a prop in their carefully staged production. The invitation made no mention of my academic honors, my nonprofit work, or any of the accomplishments that actually mattered to me. 2 weeks before graduation, the true nature of the celebration became clear during a family planning meeting. Victoria had flown in from New York, where she was working at an art gallery owned by her boyfriend's family, and the dining room table was covered with party planning materials. "The Hendersons are coming," my mother announced, consulting her guest list, along with the Whitfields, the Ashfords, and the entire board of the country club. "This is an excellent opportunity to reintroduce Charlotte to society before she starts her position at the firm." I looked up from my coffee. "What position at the firm?" My father didn't even glance in my direction. "We've arranged an entry-level analyst position. You'll start in July, right after a month-long vacation in the Hamptons to decompress from college." The presumption took my breath away. "I never agreed to work for your firm. I have other plans." The room went silent. Victoria stopped arranging flowers, and my mother set down her pen with the deliberate precision she used when extremely displeased. "Other plans?" my father repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "Such as?" I had been dreading this moment for 4 years, but it had finally arrived. "I've accepted a position with Urban Development Alliance. It's a nonprofit focused on sustainable housing solutions for low-income communities. The salary isn't much, but the work is important, and there's potential for rapid advancement based on impact rather than—" "Absolutely not." My mother's voice cut through my explanation like a blade. "You are not throwing away your Columbia education to play social worker with poor people. The Ashford's daughter is a social worker, and they're mortified every time someone asks about her career." "This isn't about the Ashfords," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is about my life and what I want to do with it." Victoria, who had been silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke. "Charlotte, be practical. You can do charity work as a hobby after you're established in a real career. All the women in our circle serve on nonprofit boards. You don't need to actually work for one." The dismissal of my passion as a hobby crystallized everything wrong with my family's worldview. To them, helping people was something you did for social credit, not because you believed in justice or systemic change. "The party is in 2 weeks, my father said with finality. "You'll attend, you'll be gracious to our guests, and after graduation, you'll take the position I've arranged. This discussion is over." But I knew it wasn't over. As I sat in that dining room, surrounded by party decorations for an event designed to celebrate a version of me that didn't exist, I made a decision that would change everything. If they wanted to use my graduation as a showcase for their values, I would let them. But they had no idea what they were actually putting on display. The morning of my graduation party dawned clear and beautiful, the kind of perfect spring day that my mother would later claim she had personally arranged with divine intervention. I woke early in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by remnants of the person my parents had tried to shape me into. Tennis trophies I'd won to please them, photos from charity events where I'd smiled on cue, acceptance letters to internships I'd turned down to pursue my real passions. As I dressed in the outfit my mother had selected, a conservative navy dress that screamed "appropriate young lady," I could hear the catering staff setting up in the garden below. Crystal chandeliers hung from the tent. Tables draped in ivory linens were arranged in perfect symmetry, and flowers that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent created an atmosphere of refined elegance. My phone buzzed with a text from my supervisor at Urban Development Alliance. "Congratulations, Charlotte. Can't wait to see you change the world. Proud of you." The message filled me with warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold perfection being arranged outside my window. At breakfast, my mother reviewed the day's timeline with military precision. "Guests arrive at 2. We'll have cocktails and light conversation until 3, when we'll move to the main presentation area for speeches. Your father will speak first, then Victoria will say a few words about sisterly pride, and then we'll transition to lunch. I noticed my absence from the speaking schedule. What about me? Oh, sweetheart, my mother replied with a patronizing smile. We thought it would be more elegant if family members spoke on your behalf. You know how nervous you get with public speaking. This was news to me. I had given presentations to Columbia professors, pitched nonprofit initiatives to foundation boards, and spoken at community events throughout college. But in my mother's selective memory, I was still the shy child who needed protection from public attention. The first guests began arriving at exactly 2 o'clock, a parade of wealth and social status that represented the pinnacle of Connecticut society. I watched from my bedroom window as couples emerged from luxury cars, the women in designer dresses with handbags worth more than most cars, the men in perfectly tailored suits that screamed old money. When I finally descended to join the party, my mother intercepted me with a fixed smile and panic in her eyes. Charlotte, there's been a small change of plans. The catering staff is short-handed, and we need someone to help serve drinks during the cocktail hour. I stared at her in disbelief. You want me to serve at my own graduation party? It's just for an hour, she insisted, already guiding me toward the kitchen. Victoria is handling the hosting duties. She's so much better with people, and this way you can contribute meaningfully to the event's success. In the kitchen, I found myself face-to-face with Maria, the head caterer, who looked as uncomfortable as I felt. Miss Charlotte, she said quietly, your mother insists. But this doesn't feel right to me. It's okay, Maria, I replied, accepting the server's apron she handed me. Sometimes we have to play roles we don't choose. As I tied the apron around my dress, I caught sight of myself in the kitchen's stainless steel surface. The girl looking back at me had spent 4 years hiding her true self, compromising her values, and accepting treatment that violated every principle of dignity and respect I had learned to value. For the next hour, I moved through the party like a ghost, carrying trays of champagne and canapes to guests who looked through me as if I were invisible. I listened to conversations about vacation homes and stock portfolios, art acquisitions and charity galas, where the goal was being photographed rather than raising money for causes. Mrs. Henderson, one of my mother's closest friends, accepted a glass of champagne from my tray without acknowledgement, then turned to the woman beside her. Patricia has done such a wonderful job with Victoria, she said, as if I weren't standing 3 feet away. It's a shame about the other daughter. I hear she's planning to work with poor people. The casual dismissal of my life's calling as something shameful burned through me, but I maintained my composure. These people had no idea who I was or what I had accomplished. They saw only what my parents had shown them, the disappointing daughter who didn't fit their mold. As I returned to the kitchen for another tray, I overheard my father speaking to a group of men near the bar. Charlotte's going through a rebellious phase, he was saying with forced joviality. All young people want to save the world these days. She'll grow out of it when she starts working in the real world. The real world, according to my father, was one where success was measured solely by wealth accumulation and social status. The work I had been doing, helping families find stable housing, creating programs that lifted people out of poverty, building communities where children could thrive, apparently didn't qualify as real. Victoria found me in the kitchen as I was arranging another tray of appetizers. She looked stunning in a pale pink dress that perfectly complemented her blonde hair, every inch the society princess our parents had molded her to become. Charlotte, she said softly, I feel terrible about this. You shouldn't be serving at your own party. Then why aren't you stopping it? I asked, meeting her eyes directly. She looked away, fidgeting with her pearl bracelet. You know how mother gets when things don't go according to her plan. It's easier to just go along with it. Easier for whom? Victoria didn't answer, but her silence spoke volumes. It had always been easier for her to accept our parents' favoritism than to question the system that benefited her. She had never had to fight for recognition, never had her dreams dismissed, never been made to feel like her values were embarrassing character flaws. As I picked up the tray to return to the party, Victoria caught my arm. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I think what you're doing with your career is admirable. I could never be that brave. Her admission surprised me, but it also highlighted the fundamental difference between us. I hadn't chosen courage. I had chosen authenticity. The price of living according to my parents' expectations was a version of myself I couldn't recognize in the mirror. The cocktail hour stretched on, each passing minute adding weight to the humiliation I was being asked to endure. But something else was building inside me too, a crystalline clarity about who I was and what I would no longer accept. This party was supposed to be about my accomplishments, yet I was being treated like hired help, while Victoria basked in reflected glory she hadn't earned. As 3 o'clock approached and guests began moving toward the main presentation area, I made a decision that would change everything. I untied my apron, smoothed my dress, and walked out of the kitchen with my head held high. If my parents wanted to showcase the Mitchell family values, they were about to get exactly that, just not in the way they had planned. What my family didn't know, as they orchestrated my humiliation in front of Connecticut's social elite, was that my 4 years at Columbia had been far more transformative than anyone imagined. While they saw my nonprofit work as a phase I would outgrow, I had quietly built something extraordinary that would soon shatter their carefully constructed narrative about success and worth. It had started during my sophomore year, when Professor Martinez in my social entrepreneurship class challenged us to identify a problem and create a sustainable solution. Most students chose safe, theoretical projects that would earn good grades without requiring real-world implementation. I chose something different: the affordable housing crisis that was displacing families throughout New York City. My initial research revealed a devastating pattern. Working families were being priced out of their neighborhoods, children were changing schools multiple times due to housing instability, and entire communities were being dismantled by gentrification. The nonprofit organizations trying to address these issues were overwhelmed, underfunded, and operating with outdated models that couldn't scale to meet the growing need. The problem isn't just money, I told Professor Martinez during office hours. It's that we're treating symptoms instead of addressing systemic causes. What if we could create a model that generates sustainable revenue while providing affordable housing? Professor Martinez leaned back in his chair, studying me with new interest. What did you have in mind? Over the next several weeks, I developed a proposal that combined social impact with business principles. Instead of traditional charity models that relied on constant fundraising, I envisioned a social enterprise that could become financially self-sustaining while providing affordable housing solutions. The concept was revolutionary: purchase underutilized properties in emerging neighborhoods, renovate them using local workforce development programs, and rent them at affordable rates to working families. The key innovation was a rent-to-own component that allowed tenants to build equity over time, eventually becoming homeowners and stabilizing communities. When I presented the idea to Professor Martinez, his response exceeded my wildest expectations. "Charlotte, this isn't just a class project. This could be a real company. Have you considered applying for the Columbia Social Innovation Challenge?" The Social Innovation Challenge was a university-wide competition that awarded $50,000 to the most promising social enterprise proposal. Previous winners had gone on to build organizations that raised millions in funding and created measurable social impact. I had never imagined my project was sophisticated enough to compete at that level. "The application deadline is in 2 weeks, Professor Martinez continued. "I think you should submit this. More importantly, I think you should start building this whether you win or not." That conversation changed the trajectory of my entire college experience. Instead of just completing assignments and maintaining good grades, I began treating my education as preparation for building something meaningful. I took additional courses in real estate development, nonprofit management, and social impact measurement. I spent my summer internships working with housing organizations to understand their operational challenges and best practices. Most significantly, I began networking in ways my parents never would have approved of. Instead of attending the society events they encouraged, I sought out meetings with social entrepreneurs, community development leaders, and impact investors. I learned that there was an entire ecosystem of people working to solve social problems through innovative business models. During my junior year, something unexpected happened. My Social Innovation Challenge application had been accepted, and I was selected as one of 10 finalists to present to a panel of judges that included successful entrepreneurs, foundation leaders, and venture capitalists focused on social impact. The presentation day was terrifying and exhilarating. Standing before a panel of accomplished professionals, I presented my housing model with a confidence I hadn't known I possessed. I explained the market opportunity, demonstrated the financial projections, and detailed the social impact metrics that would measure success. "Ms. Mitchell," said one of the judges, a woman who had built $1 billion impact investing firm, "your financial modeling is impressive, but what makes you think you can execute this vision? Building and managing real estate requires significant operational expertise." It was the question I had been preparing for all year. "You're absolutely right," I replied, "which is why I've spent the past 18 months working with housing organizations to understand their operations. I've also assembled an advisory board of real estate professionals who believe in this mission and are willing to provide guidance." This was true. Over the past year, I had convinced 3 experienced professionals to advise my project. a former executive from a major real estate development company, a retired banker who specialized in community development financing, and a nonprofit leader who had successfully scaled affordable housing programs. When the judges announced that my project had won the Social Innovation Challenge, the victory felt surreal. $50,000 in seed funding, 6 months of intensive mentorship, and access to Columbia's entrepreneur network. But more importantly, external validation that my vision was not only viable, but potentially transformative. I called my parents that night to share the news, expecting enthusiasm, or at least acknowledgement of this achievement. Instead, my mother's response was predictably dismissive. "That's nice, dear. Just remember that winning student competitions doesn't necessarily translate to real-world success. Your father's contacts in the financial industry will be much more valuable for your career." Their inability to recognize this accomplishment clarified something important for me. I would build this organization not to prove anything to them, but because the work mattered. Families needed stable housing, communities needed economic development, and I had the skills and resources to contribute to solutions. Throughout my senior year, while my parents planned my graduation party and assumed I would join the family firm, I was laying the groundwork for urban housing solutions. Using the challenge prize money, I hired a lawyer to establish the legal structure, opened business banking accounts, and began identifying potential properties for our first pilot project. The breakthrough came 3 months before graduation, when I presented my model to the Urban Development Alliance, the nonprofit where I had accepted a position. Instead of offering me an entry-level role, the executive director made a proposal that exceeded my most optimistic hopes. "Charlotte," she said, after reviewing my business plan, "we've been looking for ways to diversify our revenue streams and increase our impact. What if Urban Housing Solutions became a subsidiary of UDA? You would serve as the director, with full operational authority and access to our established networks." The partnership offered everything I needed: credibility through UDA's reputation, access to funding sources, and mentorship from experienced nonprofit leaders. More importantly, it meant I could begin implementation immediately after graduation, with a salary that made me financially independent from my parents. As I signed the partnership agreement, I realized that my 4 years of supposed rebellion had actually been the most productive period of my life. I had identified a significant social problem, developed an innovative solution, secured funding and institutional support, and positioned myself to create measurable change in people's lives. The irony was profound. While my parents focused on appearances and social standing, I had built something with substance. While they networked at country club events, I had connected with leaders who were actually changing the world. While they measured success by wealth accumulation, I had created a model that could generate both social impact and financial sustainability. Standing in that kitchen at my graduation party, wearing a server's apron while my parents entertained their friends, I carried a secret that would soon transform their understanding of success, achievement, and the daughter they had consistently underestimated. As guests moved from cocktails to the main presentation area, I hung up my server's apron and quietly slipped into the back of the audience. The tent was elegantly arranged with a small stage at the front, decorated with Columbia blue and white flowers. My parents stood near the microphone, my father adjusting his tie with the confidence of a man accustomed to being the center of attention. The audience was impressive. Probably 50 of Connecticut's most influential families, along with several business leaders my father had invited to network with. I recognized hedge fund managers, real estate developers, and old money socialites whose opinions carried weight in my parents' world. For them, this gathering represented the pinnacle of social achievement. My father took the microphone first, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he used in boardrooms. "Thank you all for joining Patricia and me today to celebrate our daughter Charlotte's graduation from Columbia University. As many of you know, Charlotte will be joining Mitchell & Associates this summer, continuing our family's tradition of excellence in financial services." A polite round of applause followed, but I noticed several guests checking their phones or engaging in whispered conversations. The speech felt rehearsed and impersonal, as if he were introducing a new business associate rather than celebrating his daughter's achievements. "Charlotte has always been our independent thinker," he continued, with a chuckle that drew knowing smiles from the audience. "She spent her college years exploring various interests, but we're confident she's ready to focus on building a serious career." The dismissal of my 4 years of work as exploring various interests crystallized everything wrong with their understanding of who I was. To them, my nonprofit work, my Social Innovation Challenge victory, and my partnership with Urban Development Alliance were all just phases I would outgrow once I accepted their definition of success. Victoria took the microphone next, looking radiant in her pink dress. Her speech was warmer and more personal than my father's, filled with childhood memories and sisterly affection. "Charlotte has always been the brave one in our family," she said, her voice carrying genuine emotion. "She's never been afraid to ask difficult questions or challenge conventional thinking." For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope that Victoria might acknowledge my real accomplishments. Instead, she concluded with, "I know she's going to bring that same courage and curiosity to her new position at Mitchell & Associates. She's going to make a wonderful addition to the family business." The audience applauded politely, but I could sense their restlessness. This celebration felt hollow because it was celebrating a fiction, a version of me that existed only in my parents' imagination. They were praising achievements I hadn't pursued and a future I had no intention of accepting. As Victoria returned to her seat, my mother approached the microphone for what I assumed would be closing remarks. Instead, she surprised everyone by announcing, "We have one more special surprise today. Charlotte doesn't know this yet, but we've arranged for someone very special to join our celebration." My stomach dropped. What had they planned now? "Ladies and gentlemen," my mother continued with theatrical enthusiasm, "please welcome Dean Harrison from Columbia University's School of Business." The audience perked up with genuine interest as a distinguished man in his 60s approached the stage. I recognized Dean Harrison immediately. He was a legend in academic circles, known for his research on social entrepreneurship and his connections to major foundations and impact investors. But what was he doing here? My parents had no connection to Columbia beyond my attendance, and they certainly didn't move in academic circles. As Dean Harrison took the microphone, I felt a mixture of confusion and growing dread about what they might have arranged. "Thank you, Patricia and Richard, for inviting me to this wonderful celebration," Dean Harrison began. "I don't often attend student parties, but when I received your call about Charlotte, I knew I had to be here." My parents beamed with pride, clearly believing they had orchestrated some kind of academic endorsement that would impress their guests. My father leaned over to whisper something to Mr. Henderson, probably taking credit for his connections in higher education. "You see," Dean Harrison continued, "Charlotte Mitchell is one of the most remarkable students I've encountered in 30 years of academic administration. Her work in social entrepreneurship has already begun making real-world impact, and her vision for addressing housing inequality represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking we try to foster at Columbia." The audience was paying attention now, but I could see confusion on my parents' faces. This wasn't the generic academic praise they had expected. Dean Harrison was speaking about specific accomplishments they knew nothing about. "Many of you may not realize," the dean went on, "that Charlotte won Columbia's Social Innovation Challenge this year with a groundbreaking business model for affordable housing development. The judges were unanimous in their assessment that her project has potential for national scaling." My mother's smile had become frozen, her eyes darting toward me with something between surprise and alarm. My father maintained his composure, but I could see tension building in his jaw. This information was clearly new to them. "But the most impressive aspect of Charlotte's achievement," Dean Harrison continued, "is that she's already begun implementation. Unlike most student projects that remain theoretical, Charlotte has secured institutional partnership and funding to launch urban housing solutions as a real organization." Several guests turned to look at me with newfound interest, but my parents looked stricken. They were realizing that everything they thought they knew about my college experience had been incomplete. "I'm here today," Dean Harrison concluded, "because Charlotte represents the future of social entrepreneurship. She's proof that young people can build organizations that are both financially sustainable and socially transformative. Columbia is proud to call her an alumna, and I suspect will be following her career with great interest for many years to come." The applause that followed was markedly different from the polite clapping that had greeted earlier speeches. This was enthusiastic recognition of genuine achievement, and I could see several guests looking at me with respect rather than the dismissive tolerance they had shown earlier. As Dean Harrison stepped away from the microphone, my father quickly moved to regain control of the situation. "Thank you, Dean Harrison, for those generous words," he said, his voice slightly strained. "Charlotte has certainly been busy at Columbia, though I think we should focus on her future rather than dwelling on student projects." The attempt to minimize what Dean Harrison had just revealed was transparent and uncomfortable. Several guests exchanged glances, clearly recognizing that something significant was being downplayed. But I knew that Dean Harrison wasn't finished. As he approached my parents after stepping off the stage, I could see him engaging them in conversation that was making them increasingly uncomfortable. Whatever he was telling them was information they hadn't possessed when they planned this party. The moment had arrived for me to decide how to respond to this unexpected turn of events. My secret was no longer secret, at least not completely. The question was whether to remain silent and let my parents continue their narrative, or to step forward and claim the truth about who I was and what I had accomplished. As I stood at the back of the tent, watching my parents struggle to process information that contradicted everything they believed about my priorities and capabilities, I felt a calm certainty settle over me. This was my moment to stop living in the shadows of their expectations and step into the light of my own achievements. The next few minutes unfolded like a slow-motion collision between two different versions of reality. I watched my parents' faces as Dean Harrison continued speaking with them, their expressions shifting from confusion to alarm as they realized the magnitude of what they had missed about my college experience. Mrs. Henderson, who had earlier dismissed me as the disappointing daughter, approached with newfound curiosity. "Charlotte, dear, I had no idea you were involved in such impressive work. Tell us more about this housing project." For the first time all day, someone was speaking directly to me rather than about me. I felt the weight of dozens of eyes turning in my direction as guests who had previously looked through me now focused with genuine interest. "It's a social enterprise model," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. "We purchase underutilized properties in emerging neighborhoods and renovate them using local workforce development programs. The innovation is a rent-to-own component that allows working families to build equity over time." "How fascinating," said Mr. Ashford, one of my father's business associates. "What kind of funding are you working with?" "We secured initial seed funding through Columbia's Social Innovation Challenge," I replied, watching my mother's face grow increasingly pale. But the real breakthrough was partnering with Urban Development Alliance. They're providing institutional support and access to community development funding sources. My father finally found his voice, moving closer with a forced smile that didn't hide his distress. "Now, Charlotte, I think our guests are more interested in your plans for joining Mitchell and Associates. We shouldn't overwhelm them with details about student projects." The dismissal landed differently this time. Unlike an hour ago when I was serving drinks in the background, I was now standing center stage with an audience that had just heard a Columbia dean describe my work as groundbreaking. The attempt to minimize my achievements felt jarring and inappropriate. "Actually," said Mrs. Whitfield, one of my mother's oldest friends, "I find this absolutely riveting. Charlotte, are you saying you've already started this organization while still in college?" "Yes," I replied, my confidence growing with each question. "Urban Housing Solutions officially launched last month. We're currently identifying properties for our first pilot project in Brooklyn, and we have a waiting list of families interested in our program." Dean Harrison, who had been listening to this exchange, stepped forward with a smile. "Perhaps this would be a good time to share the other news, Charlotte." I looked at him in confusion. "What other news?" "The call I received yesterday from the Ford Foundation. They've been tracking your work since the Innovation Challenge, and they're interested in discussing a significant grant opportunity. Your model caught their attention because it addresses both housing inequality and community economic development." The Ford Foundation. I knew enough about nonprofit funding to understand the significance of their interest. They were one of the largest philanthropic organizations in the world, with grants that could transform a small project into a national program. My parents looked like they were witnessing a car accident in slow motion. Everything they thought they knew about my priorities, my capabilities, and my future was crumbling before an audience of their most important social connections. "Charlotte," my mother said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic, "perhaps we should discuss these developments privately. I'm sure our guests don't need to hear all the details of your activities." But our guests were clearly fascinated. Mr. Henderson stepped forward, extending his hand for a formal introduction. "Charlotte, I don't think we've been properly introduced. James Henderson, Henderson Development Group. I'd very much like to hear more about your renovation model." Henderson Development Group. I recognized the name. They were one of the largest real estate development companies in Connecticut, with projects throughout the Northeast. Mr. Henderson wasn't making polite conversation. This was a serious business inquiry. "The traditional model for affordable housing relies on subsidies that make projects financially unsustainable," I explained, falling into the presentation rhythm I had developed through months of pitching to potential partners. "Our approach generates revenue through market-rate commercial space on the ground floor, which subsidizes the affordable residential units above." "Mixed-use development?" Mr. Henderson nodded approvingly. "Smart approach. What's your target return on investment?" As I launched into the financial projections I had refined through countless iterations, I noticed something remarkable happening. The conversation had shifted entirely away from my parents' planned narrative about my future at Mitchell and Associates. Instead, I was discussing business strategy with some of Connecticut's most successful entrepreneurs, and they were treating me as a peer rather than a college student. Mrs. Ashford, whose daughter I now remembered was indeed a social worker, joined the discussion with evident pride. "This is exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need more of. Charlotte, have you considered how this model might work in smaller communities?" "Actually," I replied, Surprised by how natural this felt, rural affordable housing was part of my original research. The challenges are different. Lower population density, limited public transportation, but the basic principle of community-controlled development still applies. My father made another attempt to redirect the conversation. "Charlotte's certainly full of ideas," he said with forced joviality. "But let's remember, these are theoretical discussions. Real business requires experience and established relationships." The comment hung in the air awkwardly. Several guests glanced at each other with expressions that clearly communicated their discomfort with his dismissive tone. Dean Harrison stepped forward again, his voice carrying the authority of decades in academia and consulting. "Actually, Richard, I think you might be surprised by how much experience Charlotte has already gained. Her partnership with Urban Development Alliance is providing exactly the kind of practical implementation experience that most entrepreneurs spend years acquiring." Then he delivered the statement that would become the defining moment of the entire afternoon. "In fact, based on her achievements and the interest she's generating from major foundations, I would argue that Charlotte is already our most successful recent alumna in the social entrepreneurship space." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the catering staff seemed to pause in their work as the weight of his words settled over the gathering. Most successful recent alumna. Not promising student, not interesting project. Most successful. I watched my parents process this assessment from one of Columbia's most respected administrators. Everything they had believed about success, about my choices, about the hierarchy of achievement within our family, had just been publicly contradicted by an expert whose opinion carried more weight than their social circle combined. Victoria was the first to break the silence, rising from her seat with tears in her eyes. "Charlotte," she said, her voice filled with emotion I had never heard before. "I had no idea. I'm so proud of you." Her genuine recognition, free from the competitive dynamic that had defined our relationship, touched me more deeply than all the professional accolades combined. But the most significant moment came when Mr. Whitfield, one of my father's oldest business partners, addressed him directly. "Richard, I have to say, you've been remarkably modest about Charlotte's achievements. If my daughter had built something like this while still in college, I'd be telling everyone who would listen." The implication was clear. My father hadn't been modest. He had been ignorant. In front of his most important business and social connections, it had become obvious that he had fundamentally misunderstood his own daughter's capabilities and accomplishments. As conversations resumed around me, with guests asking detailed questions about my work and offering business cards for future discussions, I realized that something profound had shifted. This graduation party, designed to showcase my parents' version of success, had instead revealed the limitations of their vision and the authenticity of mine. The remainder of the party took on a surreal quality, as if we were all participating in two different events simultaneously. On the surface, it remained Patricia and Richard Mitchell's elegant garden celebration, complete with gourmet cuisine and tasteful decorations. But underneath, a fundamental power shift had occurred that would permanently alter the dynamics of our family. Guests who had barely acknowledged my presence during the cocktail hour now sought me out for meaningful conversations. Mrs. Henderson inquired about my timeline for scaling the housing model. Mr. Ashford offered to introduce me to contacts at other foundations. Victoria stayed close by my side, asking thoughtful questions about my work and occasionally jumping in to redirect conversations when relatives made outdated assumptions about my plans. My parents, meanwhile, moved through their own party like tourists in a foreign country. They smiled and made appropriate responses to congratulations about my achievements, but their discomfort was palpable. 30 years of social leadership in this community had not prepared them for the experience of being upstaged by the daughter they had consistently underestimated. The most telling moment came when Mrs. Whitfield cornered my mother near the dessert table. "Patricia, you must be so thrilled about Charlotte's foundation recognition. The Ford Foundation. My goodness, do you realize how selective they are?" I watched my mother's face cycle through emotions as she searched for an appropriate response. "Of course," she finally managed. "We've always encouraged Charlotte's interests." The pause before interests spoke volumes about how much her perspective was being forced to shift in real time. As the afternoon wound down and guests began departing, the congratulations and business card exchanges continued. Dean Harrison approached me one final time before leaving, his expression warm with mentorship and pride. "Charlotte," he said quietly, "I hope today's revelations help your family understand what many of us in academia have recognized for some time. You're building something genuinely important, and you have the skills and vision to make it succeed at scale." After the last guest departed and the catering staff finished cleanup, Our family found ourselves alone in the garden for the first time all day. The elegant party decorations remained, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. We sat around one of the linen-covered tables, surrounded by the remnants of an event that had spiraled far beyond anyone's original intentions. My father was the first to break the uncomfortable silence. "Charlotte," he said slowly, "it seems we've missed some important developments in your college experience." The understatement was so profound it bordered on comedic, but I recognized the effort it represented. Admitting ignorance was not something that came naturally to Richard Mitchell. "You have," I replied simply. "For 4 years, I've been building exactly the kind of career that matters to me, while you assumed I was just going through a phase." My mother leaned forward, her designer dress now wrinkled from the day's stress. "But sweetheart, why didn't you tell us about these achievements? The business plan competition, the partnership with that organization. We had no idea any of this was happening." "I tried to tell you," I said, remembering countless conversations where they had changed the subject or dismissed my enthusiasm. "But every time I mentioned my nonprofit work, you treated it like a distraction from real career planning. You made it clear that the only success you valued was joining the family firm." Victoria nodded in agreement. "She's right. I remember Charlotte trying to explain her projects during holiday dinners, and we always steered the conversation back to traditional career paths." My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We thought we were providing guidance based on practical experience. The business world is challenging, and we wanted to ensure you had stable prospects. But you never asked what kind of stability mattered to me," I replied. "You never considered that meaningful work might be more important than maximizing income, or that I might be capable of creating my own opportunities rather than accepting positions you arranged." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with my parents slowly confronting the reality that their assumptions about success, career development, and their daughter's capabilities had been fundamentally flawed. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation. Decades of family patterns don't dissolve in a single afternoon, but it was a beginning. The most significant breakthrough came when my mother asked, with genuine curiosity rather than skepticism, "What happens next with your housing organization?" For the first time in our relationship, she was asking about my plans without trying to redirect them toward her preferences. I explained the pilot project timeline, the Ford Foundation opportunity, and my long-term vision for expanding the model to other cities. "It sounds like you'll need legal guidance for structuring these partnerships," my father observed. "I know we haven't always understood your career choices, but if you're open to it, I have connections in nonprofit law who might be helpful." The offer surprised me. He wasn't trying to control my direction or convince me to join his firm. He was offering to support the path I had chosen, using his professional network to advance my goals rather than his own. As evening fell and we finally prepared to leave the garden, Victoria walked beside me toward the house. "Charlotte," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology. For years, I accepted the advantages of being the favorite without questioning what that meant for you. Today showed me how much I missed about who you really are." "You couldn't have known," I replied. "I spent 4 years hiding my real priorities to avoid family conflicts. That was my choice. But I could have asked better questions," she insisted. "I could have shown more interest in what actually mattered to you instead of assuming you'd eventually want what I wanted." Her acknowledgement meant more than any professional recognition I had received. Victoria and I had spent our entire lives competing for parental approval, but today had revealed that we each had value that didn't require comparison or competition. 3 months later, I stood in the conference room of Urban Development Alliance, presenting our first quarter results to the board of directors. The pilot project was exceeding projections, with 3 families already on track to transition from renters to homeowners. The Ford Foundation had approved a substantial planning grant for national expansion research. Most importantly, I had learned to define success according to my own values rather than seeking external validation. The recognition from Columbia, the foundation interest, and even my parents' eventual understanding were gratifying, but they weren't the source of my satisfaction. That came from knowing that my work was making measurable differences in people's lives. My relationship with my parents continued to evolve slowly. They still didn't fully understand my career choices, but they had stopped trying to redirect them. My father occasionally forwarded articles about social entrepreneurship, and my mother had even attended a Urban Development Alliance fundraising event. More significantly, they had begun introducing me to their friends as Charlotte, who runs a housing nonprofit, rather than Charlotte, who's still figuring out her career path. It was a small change in language that represented a fundamental shift in how they saw me. Victoria and I developed a genuine friendship for the first time in our adult lives. She visited my office, volunteered at several events, and became one of my most enthusiastic advocates within their social circle. Her boyfriend's family foundation eventually became one of our donors, creating a connection between her world and mine that neither of us had imagined possible. The greatest transformation, however, was internal. I no longer needed my parents' approval to feel worthy of respect. I no longer measured my achievements against Victoria's different path. I had learned that authentic success comes from aligning your actions with your values, regardless of whether others understand or appreciate your choices. 1 year after that graduation party, I received an invitation that brought the story full circle. Columbia was hosting its annual Social Innovation Showcase, and Dean Harrison had asked me to speak about urban housing solutions as a featured success story. As I prepared my presentation, I reflected on how much had changed since that afternoon when I served champagne to guests who couldn't see me. The night before the showcase, my parents called with unexpected news. "Charlotte," my mother said, "we'd like to attend your presentation tomorrow, if that would be appropriate." Their request surprised me. In the past year, they had shown increasing interest in my work, but this represented a new level of engagement. They wanted to enter my world rather than trying to bring me into theirs. "I'd love to have you there," I replied honestly. The next evening, I stood before an audience of students, faculty, and social entrepreneurs, sharing the story of how urban housing solutions had grown from a class project to an organization serving families across 3 states. As I spoke about the importance of persistence, authenticity, and creating change through systematic innovation, I caught sight of my parents in the audience. My father was taking notes, his expression focused and engaged in a way I had rarely seen outside of business meetings. My mother was listening with the same attention she usually reserved for Victoria's accomplishments. For the first time, they were seeing me in my element, understanding the context that made my career choices meaningful. After the presentation, during the reception that followed, something remarkable happened. My parents didn't introduce themselves as Charlotte's parents to the people they met. Instead, they asked thoughtful questions about social entrepreneurship, listened to other speakers' presentations, and engaged with the content rather than just supporting their daughter. Dean Harrison approached us during the reception, his smile warm with recognition. "Richard, Patricia, you must be incredibly proud of Charlotte's achievements. She's become one of our most effective ambassadors for socially conscious business development." "We are," my father replied, and for the first time in our relationship, I believed he meant it completely. Though I have to admit, it took us longer than it should have to understand what she was building. His honesty about their initial misunderstanding, shared publicly with someone whose opinion mattered in my professional world, felt like a final resolution of the conflicts that had defined our family dynamic for years. As we left the showcase that evening, Victoria, who had driven down from New York specifically to attend, linked her arm through mine. "You know what I realized tonight?" she said as we walked through Columbia's campus under the spring evening lights. "What's that?" "All those years, I thought I was the successful sister because I met their expectations easily. But you were building something much more impressive. You were creating your own definition of success instead of accepting someone else's." Her insight captured something essential about the journey that had brought us to this point. Success isn't about meeting external standards or gaining approval from authority figures. It's about identifying what matters to you and having the courage to pursue it, even when others can't understand your vision. Today, Urban Housing Solutions has expanded to serve families in 8 states, with a waiting list that stretches for months. We've helped more than 200 families transition from renters to homeowners, created job training programs that have launched dozens of careers in construction and community development, and demonstrated that affordable housing can be both socially transformative and financially sustainable. More importantly, the model has inspired similar organizations across the country, proving that innovative approaches to social problems can create ripple effects far beyond their original scope. The Ford Foundation funding allowed us to develop replication toolkits that other communities have used to adapt our model to their specific needs. My relationship with my parents has evolved into something I never thought possible: genuine mutual respect. They still don't fully understand why I chose social work over finance, but they understand that my choice was informed by clear vision rather than youthful rebellion. They've become some of my most effective advocates, using their business networks to connect urban housing solutions with potential corporate partners and individual donors. Most surprisingly, my father recently asked if I would consider consulting with Mitchell and Associates on their corporate social responsibility strategy. "We have clients asking about impact investing," he explained, "and I think your perspective on sustainable social ventures could be valuable to our business development." The invitation to collaborate professionally, on my terms, leveraging my expertise, represented a complete reversal of our original dynamic. Instead of asking me to abandon my values to join his world, he was asking to incorporate my values into his world. As I write this story, I'm preparing for another milestone that would have seemed impossible a few years ago. Next month, I'll be speaking at the Connecticut Business Leadership Forum, addressing an audience that will include many of the same people who attended my graduation party. But this time, I'll be introduced not as someone's daughter, but as the founder and CEO of an organization that's changing how communities approach affordable housing development. The most profound change, however, isn't in how others see me, but in how I see myself. That afternoon when I served champagne at my own graduation party, I learned that dignity can't be taken away by external circumstances. It can only be surrendered by internal compromise. Standing in that kitchen, wearing a server's apron while my achievements were dismissed, I chose to maintain my sense of self-worth regardless of how I was being treated. That choice to value my own assessment of my worth more than others' opinions became the foundation for everything that followed. It allowed me to build an organization aligned with my values, develop relationships based on authenticity rather than approval-seeking, and create the kind of life that feels meaningful rather than just successful by conventional standards. If you've ever felt like the family disappointment, the one whose dreams don't match your relatives' expectations, I want you to know this. Their inability to see your value doesn't diminish it. Their discomfort with your choices doesn't invalidate them. Sometimes the greatest gift families can give us is the motivation to prove that we're capable of more than they imagined. Thank you for joining me on this journey from humiliation to vindication, from hiding my true self to claiming my authentic success. If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need to hear that it's possible to transform rejection into resilience and dismissal into determination. Hit that like button if you believe that sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming exactly who you were meant to be, and subscribe for more stories about turning life's challenges into stepping stones toward meaningful achievement. Remember, you don't need anyone's permission to pursue what matters to you, and you don't need anyone's approval to feel proud of what you accomplish. Sometimes the most powerful response to being underestimated is simply proving, through your actions and achievements, that their assessment was wrong. The family that serves you champagne at your own celebration today might be asking for your guidance tomorrow. Stay true to your vision, trust in your capabilities, and never let anyone convince you that their limitations should become yours.